The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 3, continued. Cassette 7, Side 1. Jean Bouillon completed the brilliant trio of architects who adorned France in the reigns of Catherine's husband and sons. In his 30s, at Écouen, he made his reputation by designing for Anne de Montmorency a chateau quite perfect in its classic lines. In his 60s, he succeeded Delorme in building the Tuileries and continued working till his death. De jour en jour, en apprenant mourant, as he said, from day to day, while learning dying. It is the fashion to regret the importation of Italian styles into French building, and to suggest that the native Gothic, left undeflected by that influence, might have evolved into a civic architecture more congenial to French grace than the relatively rigorous lines of the classic orders. But Gothic was dying of old age, perhaps of senile excess and flamboyant old lace. It had run its course. The Greek emphasis on restraint, simplicity, stability, and clear structural lines was well suited to temper French exuberance into disciplined maturity. Some medieval quaintness was sacrificed, but that too had had its day, and it seems picturesque precisely because it died. As French Renaissance architecture developed its own national character, mingling dormer windows and sloping roofs with columns, capitals, and pediments, it gave France for 3 centuries a style of building that was the envy of Western Europe. And now that it too is passing away, we perceive that it was beautiful. 2. The Ancillary Arts. 1,000 artisans adorned French life in this vivacious age of François Ier and Henri II. Woodworkers carved the choir stalls of Beauvais, Amiens, Auch, and Brou, and dared to decorate Gothic structures with a Renaissance play of fauns, sibyls, bacchantes, satyrs, even, now and then, a Venus, a Cupid, a Ganymede. Or they made, for our mad pursuit, tables, chairs, frames, prie-dieu, bedsteads, and cabinets, carving them with perhaps a plethora of ornament, and sometimes inlaying them with metal, ivory, or precious stones. The metalworkers, now at the crest of their excellence, glorified utensils and weapons with damascening or engraving, and designed grills, poems in iron tracery, for chapels, sanctuaries, gardens, and tombs, or made such hinges as those on the west doors of Notre Dame, so beautiful that piety ascribed them to angelic hands. Cellini, who had little praise left for others after meeting his own needs, confessed that in making church plate, or such domestic plate as Jean Duret engraved for Henry II, the French goldsmiths had attained a degree of perfection nowhere else to be found. The stained glass in Margaret of Austria's chapel at Brou, or in Saint-Étienne's at Beauvais, or in Saint-Étienne-du-Mont at Paris, proclaimed a glory not yet departed. At Fontainebleau, Francis established a factory in which tapestries were woven in one piece, instead of being made, as before, in separate sections, then sewn together. And gold and silver threads were mingled opulently with dyed silk and wool. After 1530, the patterns and subjects of French tapestry ceased to be Gothic and chivalric, and followed Renaissance designs and themes from Italy. Renaissance motives dominated ceramics in the Majolica of Lyon, the faience of southern France, the enamels of Limoges. Léonard Limousin and others painted, with brilliant fused enamel colors, elegant forms of plants and animals, gods and men, on copper basins, vases, ewers, cups, salt cellars, and other lowly utensils raised to works of art. Here, too, Francis took a hand, made Léonard head of the royal manufactory of enamels at Limoges, and crowned him with the title of valet de chambre du roi. Léonard specialized in painting portraits in enamel on copper plates. An excellent sample, portraying Francis himself, is in the Metropolitan Museum at New York. Many more are in the Apollo Gallery of the Louvre, quietly attesting a golden day. Portraiture was a fully developed art in France before the Italians came. Which of the Italians in France could have bettered the portrait of Guillaume de Montmorency, painted by an anonymous master about 1520, and now in the Lyon Museum? Voilà un homme. This is no pictorial compliment, it is a man. Rosso, Primaticcio, Dell'Abate, and others in the school of Fontainebleau brought to France what they had learned from Raphael, Perino del Vaga, Giovanni da Udine, or Giulio Romano, in decorating pilasters, cornices, ceilings, with grotesques or playful figures of cherubs, children, spirals, arabesques, and plants. An unnamed member of the school painted the Diane de Poitiers, now in the Worcester, Massachusetts Museum, sitting at her toilette, dressed in a diadem. After 1545, many Flemish painters, including Bruegel the Elder, came to France to study the work at Fontainebleau, but their own style was too deeply rooted to yield to the Italian influence. The realistic vigor of their portraiture prevailed over the feminine grace of the heirs of Raphael. One Flemish family in France almost constituted a school by itself. Jean Clouet was attached to the court of Francis at Tours and Paris. All the world knows the portrait he painted of the king about 1525, now in the Louvre. Proud, conceited, happy royalty just before a fall. Jean's son, François Clouet, succeeded him as court painter, and recorded the dignitaries of 4 reigns in chalk or oil. His Henry II surpasses his father's Francis I. We are astonished to see the chasm between the gay gallant and the sombre son. We can understand how this man could sanction the Chambre Ardente for the persecution of heresy, though we do not see in the almost Borgian face any hint of his lasting devotion to Diane. For a time, Cornet de Lion, operating a rival atelier, challenged the Clouets in such portraits as that of Maréchal Bonnivet, lover of Marguerite. But no contemporary in France could equal the gallery of portraits that François Clouet made of Catherine de Médicis, Francis II, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth of Valois, Philip II, Marguerite, future wife of Henry IV, and Charles IX as a youth, too lovely to forecast the frightened king of the massacre. Flemish realism and veracity are in these portraits tempered with French delicacy, precision, and vivacity. The tone is subdued, the line is accurate and confident, the elements of a complex character are caught and unified. Only Holbein's England would enjoy such a colorful historian. Sculpture was a handmaiden to architecture, and yet it was the sculptors who made the architecture brilliant. Now, indeed, French sculpture poured forth masterpieces only second to those that Michelangelo and others were then cutting out of Carrara. Lordly tombs were modeled, of Louis XII and Anne of Brittany by Giovanni di Giusto Betti at Saint-Denis, of 2 cardinals of Amboise by Roland Leroux and Jean Goujon at Rouen, and of Louis de Brezé, Diane's husband, in the same cathedral, of uncertain authorship. The Rouen tombs seem too ornate to befit mortality, but the cardinals are almost revived as unidealized strong administrators to whom religion was an incident in statesmanship. Francis I, his wife Claude, and his daughter Charlotte were buried in Saint-Denis in a tomb of Renaissance style designed by Delorme, with superb sculptures by Pierre Bontemps. Nearby is a little chef-d'oeuvre by Bontemps, a funerary urn for the heart of the king. French sculptors no longer needed Italian tutelage to inherit the classic art of Rome. Jean Goujon inherited at least the classic grace. We hear of him first in 1540, listed as a stone-cutter and mason in Rouen. There he cut the columns supporting the organ in the church of Saint-Maclou, and carved statues for the tombs of the cardinals, and perhaps for that of Brezé. He adorned the rood screen in the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, with sculptures now partially preserved in the Louvre, and recalling Hellenistic reliefs in the rhythmic elegance of their lines. Goujon's characteristic quality of feminine grace approached perfection in the nymphs that he contributed to the Fountain of the Innocents, designed by Lescaut in 1547. Bernini thought these figures the most beautiful works of art in Paris. We have noted Goujon's Diana and the Stag at Anet and his sculptures on the Louvre. His pagan deities and his idealization of the female form suggest, for France, the triumph of the Renaissance over the Reformation, of classical over Gothic ideas, of woman over her medieval detractors. However, tradition describes Goujon as a Huguenot. About 1542, as penance for attending a Lutheran sermon, he was condemned to walk through the streets of Paris in his shirt and to witness the burning of a Protestant preacher. Toward 1562, he left France for Italy. He died at Bologna before 1568, in obscurity hardly merited by the man who had brought to its culmination the art of the Renaissance in France. 3. Peter Bruegel, 1520 to 1569. Except for Bruegel and tapestry, this was a fallow age in lowland art. Painting fluctuated between emulation of the Italians, in refined technique, rich coloring, classic mythology, nude women, and Roman architectural backgrounds, and the native flair for realistic portrayal of eminent persons and ordinary things. Patronage came not only from the court, the church, and the aristocracy, but increasingly from rich merchants who offered their stout forms and overflowing jowls to the admiration of posterity, and liked to see reflected in painting the domestic scenes and rural landscapes of their actual life. A sense of humor, sometimes of the grotesque, replaced the lofty mood of the Italian masters. Michelangelo criticized what seemed to him a lack of discrimination and nobility in Flemish art. They paint in Flanders only to deceive the external eye, things that gladden you, the grass of the fields, the shadows of the trees and bridges and rivers, and little objects here and there, without care in selecting and rejecting. To Michelangelo, art was the selection of significance for the illustration of nobility, not the indiscriminate representation of reality. His solemn nature, encased in his irremovable boots and his misanthropic isolation, was immune to the glory of green fields and the affections of the hearth. For our part, we make a grateful bow to Joachim Patinier, if only for the Leonardesque landscape in his St. Jerome, to Jos van Cleve for his lovely portrait of Eleanor of Portugal, to Bernard van Orly for his Holy Family in the Prado, his tapestry designs, and his stained glass in Brussels Saint Gudule, to Lucas van Leyden for crowding so many masterly engravings and woodcuts into his 39 years, to Jan van Scorel for the Magdalene cherishing the vase of ointments from which she had bathed the feet of Christ, and to Antonis More for his forceful portraits of Alva, Cardinal Granville, Philip II, Mary Tudor, and, not least, himself. Note how the painting craft in the Netherlands ran in families. Jos van Cleve handed down some of his skill to his son Cornelis, who painted some fine portraits before going mad. Jan Massijs, inheriting the studio of his father Quentin, painted by preference nudes like Judith and Susanna and the Elders. His son Quentin Massijs II carried on the trade, while his brother Cornelis took his art to England and painted Henry VIII in old age, bloated and hideous. Peter Porbus and his son Franz painted portraits and pieties at Bruges, and Franz's son Franz Porbus II painted portraits at Paris and Mantua. And there were Peter Droll Bruegel, his painter wife, his painter mother-in-law, his sons Peter Hell Bruegel and Jan Velvet Bruegel, his painter grandsons, his painter great-grandsons. Peter Bruegel the Elder, whose fame is among the inescapable fashions of our time, may have derived his name from either of two villages named Bruegel in Brabant. One of them was near Hertogenbosch, where Hieronymus Bosch had been born, and in whose churches Peter might have seen several paintings of the man who influenced his work only less than nature itself. At 25, circa 1545, he migrated to Antwerp and was apprenticed to Peter Kukke, whose landscape woodcuts may have helped to form the young painter's interest in fields, woods, waters, and sky. This lesser Peter had begotten a daughter, Maria, whom Bruegel toddled in his arms as a child, and whom he later made his wife. In 1552 he followed the current custom of his craft and went to study painting in Italy. He returned to Antwerp with a sketchbook thick with Italian landscapes, but with no visible Italian influence on his technique. To the end, he practically ignored the subtle modeling, chiaroscuro, and coloratura of the southern masters. Back in Antwerp, he lived with a housekeeper concubine whom he promised to marry when she stopped lying. He recorded her lies with notches cut into a stick, and having no stick for his own sins, he renounced her when the notches overflowed. In his middle 40s, in 1563, he married Maria Kukke, now 17, and obeyed her summons to move to Brussels. He had only 6 years of life left to him. Though his paintings led to his being dubbed Peasant Bruegel, he was a man of culture, who read Homer, Virgil, Horace, Ovid, Rabelais, probably Erasmus. Karl Mander, the Dutch Vasari, described him as tranquil and orderly, speaking little, yet amusing in company, delighting to horrify people with tales of ghosts and banshees. Hence, perhaps, his other sobriquet, Droll Bruegel. His sense of humor leaned to satire, but he tempered this with sympathy. A contemporary engraving shows him heavily bearded, with a face bearing lines of serious thought. At times he followed Bosch in seeing life as a heedless hurrying of most souls to hell. In the Dulle Griet he pictured hell as hideously and confusedly as Bosch himself, and in the Triumph of Death He envisioned death not as a natural sleep of exhausted forms, but as a ghastly cutting off of limbs and life. Skeletons attacking kings, cardinals, knights, and peasants with arrows, hatchets, stones, and scythes. Criminals beheaded or hanged or bound to a wheel. Skulls and corpses riding in a cart. Here is one more variant of that dance of death which flits through the art of this somber age. Bruegel's religious pictures carry on the serious mood. They have neither the grandeur nor the light grace of Italian pictures. They merely reinterpret the biblical story in terms of Flemish climate, physiognomy, and dress. They rarely reveal religious feeling. Most of them are excuses for painting crowds. Even the faces in them carry no feeling. The people who jostle one another to see Christ carry his cross seem heedless of his suffering, but only anxious to get a good view. Some of the pictures are biblical parables, like the sower. Some others, following Bosch, take proverbs for their themes. The blind leading the blind shows a succession of dull-eyed peasants, cruelly ugly, following one another into a ditch. And Netherlandish proverbs illustrates in one teeming picture nearly 100 old saws, including some of Rabelaisian fragrance. Bruegel's major interest was in peasant crowds and landscapes covering with their indifferent beneficence or maleficence the futile, forgivable activities of men. Perhaps he thought there was safety in crowds. Here he need not individualize the faces or model the flesh. He refused to picture a person posing for art or history. He preferred to show men, women, and children walking, running, jumping, dancing, playing games, all in the varied animation and naturalness of life. He harked back to the scenes of his childhood and delighted to contemplate, to join, the fun and feasting, music and mating of the peasantry. He and a friend, on several occasions, disguised themselves as farmers, attended village fairs and weddings, and, pretending to be relatives, brought presents to bridegroom and bride. Doubtless on these outings Peter took his sketchbook, for among his extant drawings are many of rustic figures and events. He had no taste for, nor commissions from, the aristocrats that Moore and Titian found so profitable to portray. He painted only simple people, and even his dogs were mongrel curs that could be found in any city alley or rural hut. He knew the bitter side of peasant life, and sometimes visioned it as a multitudinous confusion of fools. But he loved to paint the games of country children, the dances of their elders, the riot of their weddings. In the land of Cockaigne, peasants exhausted with toil or love or drink sprawl out on the grass dreaming of utopia. It is the peasant, Bruegel seems to say, who knows how to play and sleep as well as how to work and mate and die. Against death he saw but one consolation, that it is an integral part of that nature which he accepted in all its forms of beauty and terror, growth and decay and renewal. The landscape redeems the man. The absurdity of the part is pardoned in the majesty of the whole. Heretofore, excepting Altdorfer, landscapes had been painted as backgrounds and appendages to human figures and events. Bruegel made the landscape itself the picture, the men in it mere incidents. In the fall of Icarus, the sky, the ocean, the mountains, and the sun have absorbed the attention of the painter and of the participants. Icarus is two unnoticed legs ridiculously sinking into the sea. And in the storm, man is hardly visible, lost and helpless in the war and power of the elements. The art and philosophy of Bruegel culminate in the 5 paintings that remain of a series planned to illustrate the moods of the year. The wheat harvest schematically pictures the cutting and stacking of the sheaves, the workers lunching or napping beneath the visible heat and stillness of the summer air. In the hay harvest, girls and boys bear the autumn fruit of the fields in baskets on their heads. A farmer sharpens his scythe, sturdy women rake the hay, men pitch it to the top of the wagon load, the horses champ their meal in a resting interval. The return of the herd heralds winter, the skies darkling, the cattle guided back to their stalls. Finest of the series is the hunters in the snow. Roofs and grounds are white. Dwellings range in an amazing perspective along the hills and plains. Men skate, play hockey, fall on the ice. Hunters and their dogs start out to capture food. The trees are bare, but birds in the branches promise spring. The gloomy day is winter scowling its farewell. In these paintings, Bruegel reached his peak and set a precedent for the snowy landscapes of future lowland art. Only a painter or a connoisseur can judge these pictures in their artistic quality and technique. Bruegel seems content to give his figures 2 dimensions, does not bother to mingle shadow with their substance. He lets our imagination, if it must, add a third dimension to his two. He is too interested in crowds to care about individuals. He makes nearly all his peasants alike, ungainly lumps of flesh. He does not pretend to be a realist except in gross. He puts so many people or episodes into one painting that unity seems sacrificed, but he catches the unconscious unity of a village, a crowd, a wave of life. What does he mean to say? Is he merely jesting, laughing at man as a grotesque forked radish, and at life as a silly strutting to decay? He enjoyed the lusty swing of the peasants' dance, sympathized with their toil, and looked with indulgent humor on their drunken sleep. But he never recovered from bosh. Like that unsaintly Jerome, he took sardonic pleasure in depicting the bitter side of the human comedy, the cripples and criminals, the defeated or obscene, the inexorable victory of death. He seems to have searched for ugly peasants. He caricatures them, never lets them smile or laugh. If he gives their crude faces any expression, it is one of dull indifference, of sensitivity beaten out by the blows of life. He was impressed and hurt by the apathy with which the fortunate bear the misery of the unfortunate, the haste and relief with which the living forget the dead. He was oppressed by the vast perspective of nature, that immensity of sky under which all human events seem drowned in insignificance, and virtue and vice, growth and decay, nobility and ignominy alike seem lost in a vast and indiscriminate futility, and man is swallowed up in the landscape of the world. We do not know if this was Bruegel's real philosophy or merely the playfulness of his art, nor do we know why he gave up the battle so soon, dying at 49 in 1569. Perhaps more years would have softened his wrath. He bequeathed to his wife an ambiguous picture, The Merry Way to the Gallows, a masterly composition in fresh greens and distant blues, peasants dancing near the village gibbet, and perched on this, a magpie, emblem of a chattering tongue. 4. Cranach and the Germans. German ecclesiastical architecture went in hiding during the Reformation. No new churches were raised to art as well as piety. Many churches were left unfinished. Many were pulled down, and princely castles were put together with their stones. Protestant churches dedicated themselves to a stern simplicity. Catholic churches, as if in defiance, ran to excessive ornament, while the Renaissance moved into the Baroque. Civic and palace architecture replaced cathedrals as dukes replaced bishops and the state enveloped the church. Some picturesque civic structures of this period were casualties of the Second World War. The Althaus in Brunswick, the House of the Butchers' Guild at Hildesheim, the Renaissance-style Rathaus or Town Hall of Nijmegen. The most pretentious architecture of this and the next age took the form of immense castles for the territorial princes. Dresden Castle, which cost the people 100,000 florins, or about $2.5 million. The palace of Duke Christopher at Stuttgart, so lavish in fixtures and furniture that the city magistrates warned the Duke that the luxury of his court was scandalously in contrast with the poverty of his people. And the vast Heidelberg Castle, begun in the 13th century, rebuilt in Renaissance fashion between 1556 and 1563, and partly destroyed in the Second World War. The art crafts retained their excellence in the service of princes, nobles, merchants, and financiers. Cabinet makers, woodcutters, ivory cutters, engravers, miniaturists, textile workers, iron workers, potters, goldsmiths, armorers, jewelers, all had the old medieval skills, though they tended to sacrifice taste and form to complexity of ornament. Many painters drew designs for woodcuts as carefully as if they were making portraits of kings. And woodcutters like Hans Lützeberger of Basel labored with the devotion of a Dürer. The goldsmiths of Nuremberg, Munich, and Vienna were at the top of their line. Wenzel Janitzer might have challenged Cellini. About 1547, German artists began to paint glass with enamel colors. In this way, vessels and windows took on crude but rich designs, and the prosperous bourgeois could have his likeness fused into the window panes of his home. German sculptors kept their preference for metal statuary and reliefs. The sons of Peter Vischer carried on his craft. Peter the Younger cast a bronze plaque of Orpheus and Eurydice. Hans designed a handsome Apollo fountain for the court of the Nuremberg town hall. Paul is usually credited with a pretty figure in wood known as the Nuremberg Madonna. Peter Flüttner of Nuremberg cast excellent reliefs of envy, justice, Saturn, and the muse of dance. One of the most delightful objects in the Louvre is a bust by Joachim Deschler of Otto Heinrich, Count Palatine, 6.5 inches high and nearly as wide in its corpulence, with a face formed by years of bon appetit. This is German humor at its broadest. The glory of German art continued to be in painting. Holbein equaled Dürer, Cranach followed on their heels, and Baldung Green, Altdorfer, and Amberger formed a creditable second line. Hans Baldung Green made his fame with an altarpiece for the Cathedral of Freiburg im Breisgau. But more attractive is the Madonna with the Parrot, a buxom Teuton with golden hair and a parrot pecking at her cheeks. Christopher Amberger painted some elegant portraits. The Lille Museum has his Charles V, sincere, intelligent, incipiently fanatical. The Chicago Art Institute's portrait of a man is a finely chiseled, gentle face. Albrecht Altdorfer stands out in this minor group by the richness of his landscapes. In his St. George, the knight and the dragon are almost unseen in an entourage of crowding trees. Even the Battle of Arbela loses the warring hosts in an abundance of towers, mountains, waters, clouds, and sun. These, and the Rest on the Flight to Egypt, are among the first true landscapes in modern painting. Lucas Cranach the Elder took his name from his native town, Cranach, in Upper Franconia. We know almost nothing further of him till his appointment, at the age of 32, as court painter to Elector Frederick the Wise at Wittenberg in 1504. He kept his position at the Saxon court, there, or at Weimar, for nearly 50 years. He met Luther, liked him, pictured him again and again, and illustrated some of the reformers' writings with caricatures of the popes. However, he made portraits also of Catholic notables like the Duke of Alva and Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz. He had a good business head, turned his studio into a factory of portraits and religious paintings, sold books and drugs on the side, became Burgomaster of Wittenberg in 1565, and died full of money and years. The Italian influence had by this time reached Wittenberg. It appears in the grace of Cranach's religious pictures, more visibly in his mythologies, most in his nudes. Now, as in Italy, the pagan pantheon competes with Mary, Christ, and the saints, but German humor enlivens the tradition by making fun of safely dead gods. In Cranach's Judgment of Paris, the Trojan seducer goes to sleep, while the shivering beauties wait for him to wake and judge. In Venus and Cupid, the goddess of love is shown in her usual nudity, except for an enormous hat, as if Cranach were slyly suggesting that desire is so formed by custom that it can be stilled by an unwanted accessory. Nevertheless, Venus proved popular, and Cranach, with help, issued her in a dozen forms to shine in Frankfurt, Leningrad, the Borghese Gallery, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In Frankfurt she hides her charms revealingly behind a dozen gossamer threads. These serve again for the Lucretia in Berlin, who cheerfully prepares to redeem her honor with a bare bodkin. The same lady posed for the Nymph of the Spring, now in New York, lying on a bed of green leaves beside a pool. In the Geneva Museum she becomes Judith, no longer nude but dressed to kill, holding her sword over Holofernes' severed head, which winks humorously at its mischance. Finally, the lady, rebared, becomes Eve in Das Paradies at Vienna, in Adam and Eve at Dresden, in Eve and the Serpent in Chicago, where a handsome stag joins and names her party. Nearly all these nudes have some quality that saves them from eroticism, an impish humor, a warmth of color, an Italian finesse of line, or an unpatriotic slenderness in the female figures. Here was a brave attempt to reduce the Frau. The portraits that poured from Cranach's hand or aids are more interesting than his stereotyped nudes, and some rival Holbein's. Anna Caspinian is realism tempered with delicacy, gorgeous robes, and a balloon hat. The husband, Johannes Caspinian, sat for a still finer portrait, all the idealism of a young humanist reflected in the meditative eyes and symbolized in the book fondly clasped. 100 dignitaries were preserved in paint or chalk in this popular atelier, but none so well deserved survival as the child Prince of Saxony, now in Washington, all innocence and gentleness and golden curls. At the other side of life is the portrait of Dr. Johannes Schörner, terrible in features, noble in artistry. And here and there in Cranach's work are magnificent animals, all pedigreed, and stags so natural that, claimed a friend, dogs barked when they saw them. Cranach might have been greater had he not succeeded so soon and well. The multiplication of his patrons divided his genius. He had no time to give all of it to any one task. Inevitably, as his 81 years rolled by, he tired and slacked down. The drawing, once as fine as Dürer's, became careless. Details were shirked. The same faces, nudes, and trees were repeated to lifelessness. In the end, we have to agree with the judgment passed on the early Cranach by the aging Dürer, that Lucas could depict the features, but not the soul. In 1550, when he was 78, he painted his own portrait, a stout counselor and merchant rather than painter and engraver, with powerful square head, stately white beard, expansive nose, eyes full of pride and character. 3 years later he surrendered his flesh to time. He left behind him 3 sons, all artists, John Lucas, Hans, and Lucas the Younger, whose sleeping Hercules transmitted a theme from Rabelais to Swift by showing the giant peacefully ignoring the darts with which the pygmies around him barely pierce his ectoderm. Perhaps Lucas the Elder ignored as serenely the pricks of those who condemned him for bourgeois ideals and unconscientious haste. And under the tombstone that bears the ambiguous compliment Celeramus Pictor, fastest painter, he sleeps well. With him, the great age of German painting passed. The basic cause of the decline was more probably the intensity of religious dispute than the Protestant repudiation of religious imagery. Possibly a moral letdown coarsened German painting after 1520. Nudes began to play a leading role, and even in biblical pictures, painters ran to themes like Susanna and the Elders, Potiphar's wife tempting Joseph, or Bathsheba in her bath. For 2 centuries after the death of Cranach, German art receded in the backwash of theology and war. 5. The Tudor style, 1517 to 1558. The reign of Henry VIII began with a Gothic masterpiece in the chapel of Henry VII, and closed with the Renaissance architecture of royal palaces. The change of style aptly reflected the conquest of the Church by the state. The attack of the government on the bishops, the monasteries, and ecclesiastical revenues put an end to English ecclesiastical architecture for almost 100 years. Henry VII, anticipating death, had allotted £140,000, or about $14 million, to build in Westminster Abbey a Lady Chapel to contain his tomb. It is a masterpiece not of construction, but of decoration, from the cenotaph itself to the intricate stone skein of the fan vault, which has been called the most wonderful work of masonry ever put together by the hand of man. As the chapel is Gothic in plan and Renaissance in adornment, we have here the beginning of the Tudor, or florid style. Henry VIII, as a young humanist, was readily won to classical architectural forms. He and Wolsey brought several Italian artists into England. One of them, Pietro Torrigiano, was commissioned to design the paternal tomb. Upon the sarcophagus of white marble and black stone, the Florentine sculptor laid lavish decoration in carvings or gilt bronze. Plump putti, floral wreaths of airy grace, reliefs of the Virgin and divers saints, angels sitting atop the tomb and extending pretty feet into space, and over the whole the recumbent figures of Henry VII and his Queen Elizabeth. This was such sculpture as England had never seen before, and in England it has never been surpassed. Here, said Francis Bacon, the parsimonious king who had pinched pennies to spend pounds dwelleth more richly dead than he did alive in any of his palaces. Henry VIII was not the man to allow anyone to be more sumptuously buried than himself. In 1518 he contracted to pay Torrigiano £2,000 for a tomb more greater by the 4th part than his father's. This was never finished, for the artist as well as the king had a royal temper. Torrigiano left England in a huff in 1519, and when he returned he did no more work on the second tomb. Instead he designed for Henry VII's chapel a high altar, reredos and baldachin, which Cromwell's men destroyed in 1643. In 1521 Torrigiano departed for Spain. The mortal comedy was resumed in 1524 when Wolsey commissioned another Florentine, Benedetto da Rovezzano, to build him a tomb in St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The design whereof, wrote Lord Herbert of Cherbury, was so glorious that it exceeded far that of Henry VII. When the cardinal fell, he begged the king to let him keep at least the effigy for a humbler tomb in York. Henry refused and confiscated the whole as a receptacle for himself. He bade the artists replace Wolsey's figure with his own. But religion and marriage distracted him, and the funereal monument was never completed. Charles I wished to be buried in it, but a hostile parliament sold the decoration piece by piece until only the black marble sarcophagus remained, to serve at last in 1810 as part of Nelson's shrine in St. Paul's. Aside from these labors and the glorious wood screen and stalls and stained glass and vault of King's College Chapel at Cambridge, the memorable architecture of this age was dedicated to glorifying the country houses of the aristocracy and to fairy palaces rising amid the fields and woods of England. The architects were English, but a dozen Italians were enlisted for the decoration. An imposingly wide facade in mixed Gothic and Renaissance, a turreted gateway leading into a court, a spacious hall for crowded festivities, a massive staircase, usually in carved wood, rooms adorned with murals or tapestry and lighted with lattice windows or oriels, and around the buildings a garden, a deer park, and beyond a hunting ground. This was the English nobleman's skeptical forestalling of paradise. The most famous of these Tudor manor houses was Hampton Court, built by Wolsey in 1515 for himself and bequeathed in terror to his king in 1525. Not one architect, but a coalition of English master builders created it, basically in perpendicular Gothic and on a medieval plan, with moat and towers and crenellated walls. Giovanni da Maiano added a Renaissance touch in terracotta roundels on the facade. The Duke of Württemberg, visiting England in 1592, called Hampton Court the most magnificent palace in the world. Only less sumptuous were Sutton Place in Surrey, built between 1521 and 1527 for Sir Richard Weston, and Nonsuch Palace, built for Henry VIII in 1538 on an imperial scale. He invited thither, says an old description, the most excellent artificers, architects, sculptors, and statuaries of different nations, Italians, Frenchmen, Hollanders, and native Englishmen. And these presented a marvelous example of their art in the decoration of the palace, and both within and without adorned it with statues, which here recall in literal reproduction the ancient works of Rome, and elsewhere surpass them in excellence. 230 men were constantly employed on this palace, which was intended to outshine the Chambord and Fontainebleau of Francis I. Seldom had English kings been so rich, or the English people so poor. Henry died before Nonsuch could be finished. Elizabeth made it her favorite residence. Charles II gave it to his mistress, Lady Castlemaine, in 1670, who had it pulled down and sold the parts as the only way to transform a liability into an asset. 6. Holbein the Younger, 1497 to 1543. How futile are words before a work of art! Each art successfully resists translation into any other medium. It has its own inalienable quality, which must speak for itself or not at all. History can only record the masters and the masterpieces. It cannot convey them. To sit silently before Holbein's picture of his wife and children is better than a biography. However, he was more fortunate in his parentage than in his time. His father was among the leading painters in Augsburg. From him, Hans learned the elements of the art, and from Hans Burgmayer something of Italian grace and modeling. In 1512 he painted 4 altar panels, now in the Augsburg Gallery. Middling enough, but astonishingly good for a lad of 15. 2 years later he and his brother Ambrose, also a painter, decamped to Basel. Perhaps the father had insisted too much on his own, still Gothic style. Perhaps there was not enough educated money in Augsburg to support more than a few artists. In any case, youth and genius seldom love home. In Basel, the lads discovered that freedom is a trial. Hans illustrated various volumes, including Erasmus's Praise of Folly. He did some rough painter's work, made a signboard for a schoolmaster, and decorated a tabletop with lively incidents from the story of St. Nobody, that handy nonentity who was charged with every anonymous mischief and never said a word in his own defense. The skill shown in this work earned Hans a fruitful commission to paint portraits of the Burgomaster Jacob Meyer and his wife in 1517. The fame of these portraits traveled. Jacob Hertenstein called Holbein to Lucerne, and there Hans frescoed the facade and walls of the patron's home and painted that portrait of Benedict Hertenstein, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. From Lucerne he may have passed into Italy. His work henceforth revealed Italian influence in anatomical accuracy, architectural backgrounds, and the management of light. When he returned to Basel, aged 22, he set up his own studio and married a widow in 1519. In that year his brother died, and in 1524 their father. German realism mingled with Romanesque architecture and classic ornament in the religious pictures that Holbein now produced. Startling is the realism, echoing Montaigne, of Christ in the tomb, the body all bone and skin, the eyes ghastly open, the hair disheveled, the mouth agape in a last effort to breathe. This seems irrevocable death, and no wonder Dostoevsky said the picture could destroy a man's religious faith. About this time Holbein painted murals for the hall of the Grand Council in Basel. The councillors were pleased, and one of them commissioned him to provide an altarpiece for a Carthusian monastery. This Passion of Christ suffered in the iconoclastic riots of 1529, but 2 shutters were saved and were presented to the cathedral at Freiburg im Breisgau. They borrow much from Baldung Green, but they have their own power in the remarkable play of the light that emanates from the child. In 1522, the town clerk of Basel ordered another altarpiece. For this placidly beautiful Madonna, now preserved in the Kunstmuseum of Solothurn, Holbein used his wife and son as models, the wife then a woman of modest comeliness, not yet touched by tragedy. Probably near this time he produced his religious masterpiece, The Virgin and Child with the Family of Burgomaster Meyer. Splendid in composition, line, and color, and intense in feeling. We understand more sympathetically the Burgomaster's prayer to the Madonna when we learn that at the time of this painting the 2 sons pictured at his feet, and one of the 2 wives kneeling at the right, were dead. But the fees for such religious pictures were small in proportion to the care and labor they required. Portraits were more lucrative, and there was a growing family to support. In 1519 Holbein painted the young scholar Bonifacius Amerbach, a noble face in which idealism survives a penetrating view of the world. About 1522 he painted the great printer Froben, a man dedicated, disturbed, creatively worn out by life. Through Froben, Holbein came to know Erasmus, and in 1523 he painted 2 of his many portraits of the saddened humanist. In the 3/4 portrait, in the Earl of Radnor's collection at Salisbury, the artist, now in the fullness of his powers, caught the soul of a man who had lived too long. Illness and Luther had deepened the lines in the face, the melancholy in the eyes. The profile in the Basel Kunstsammlung shows him calmer and more alive, the nose advancing to battle like a gladiator's sword. Perhaps the manuscript under the pen is a draft of the De Libero Arbitrio of 1524, with which he was entering the lists against Luther. Probably in 1524 Holbein painted Erasmus again, in the best portrait of all, which hangs in the Louvre. Seeing that profound and chastened face, one thinks of Nizar's perceptive comment, that Erasmus was one of those whose glory it has been to understand much and to affirm little. About 1523 Holbein painted himself, now 26 and seemingly prosperous, but the cold glance suggests some fighting resentment of life's buffetings. Tradition discredits him with a moderate addiction to drink and women, and represents him as unhappy with his wife. Apparently he shared some Lutheran views. His woodcuts of the Dance of Death, circa 1525, satirized the clergy, but even the clergy did that in those days. The series showed death dogging the steps of every man, woman, or class. Adam, Eve, the emperor, a noble, a physician, a monk, a priest, a pope, a millionaire, an astrologer, a duchess, a jester, a gambler, a thief, all en route to the Last Judgment. It is as powerful a work as any of Dürer's in this medium. Aside from this masterpiece of drawing and the Meyer Madonna, Holbein is without visible piety. Perhaps he imbibed some skepticism from Erasmus and the Basel humanists. He was more interested in anatomy than in religion. The Reformation, though he presumably favored it, ruined his market in Basel. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.